Hello, I'm Koen Pauwels, and I'm joined today by Neil Hoyne, Chief Measurement Strategist, at Google. How are you doing, Neil?
I'm doing wonderful. Thanks for having me.
Uh, Thanks so much for accepting. I mean, it seems like just yesterday you interviewed for my book, right, about how to democratize digital in your business. But I see in your background you have your book also out there, which I very much enjoy reading, Converted.
Thank you.
So in the book, you talk about kind of your many conversations with advertisers, and to really kind of help people understand data-driven decision making, how to improve their decisions. Can you tell us a bit about your key insights? You know, what's needed to get the process started? What kind of nudge or push were you able to give, or do you think is needed for this end?
Sure. Well, let's start with the motivation behind the book. It was actually, among other things, it was a challenge from another business school professor who said there aren't enough stories about analytical failures, at least not coming out of Silicon Valley. We see a lot of case studies and puff pieces about we took machine learning and data and just magically it came forward and led into success. And when we look at the actual project performance of companies, CRM systems near and dear to my heart, we find that 90% of those are at least reported to be failures or fail to meet the objectives set out by the stakeholders implementing them within companies. And so we know a lot of things are going on, but we don't necessarily discuss it. And the context I took for the book was really to say, out of working at Google for the past 12 years, talking to several thousand companies, let's start with their failures. Now, those companies are anonymized in the sense that we don't want to shame anybody, but we do want to learn and say, what are the challenges that other companies face? Not only for warnings to other companies to be like, these are things to avoid, but also to build a little bit of empathy that when we talk about data and analytics, it's hard. It requires some struggle. You need to build up some scar tissue in organizations. And oftentimes that's where the learning start, is that to make sure that companies are aware of what are the blind spots that come to later haunt them when they're implementing some of these things. And not to ruin all the surprises in the text, but just to give you a few insights, things that commonly surface. One of the most common is simply a lack of analytical fluency in the organization. People look at these projects and say, I don't necessarily understand machine learning or artificial intelligence. I understand they're needed because they're popular. But when they don't necessarily understand how they fit into the organization's strategy, they defer those decisions to other companies, or if they don't have the competencies internally, to other vendors who come in and say, I have a product, a tool, a system that will catch you up on machine learning or AI. And these are new areas, so they don't have objective criteria by which to say, is this doing anything? As part of that, we often find that also companies will start with just looking and collecting raw data, but not necessarily knowing the questions that they want to answer. It almost becomes this idea that there's these moments, perhaps popularized by television and movies, where people sit there and they just stare at rows of data and they have this aha moment to be like, look, here's where we can find more profit. And it never happens like that because there needs to be consideration not only for the data, but the context of the business, the larger strategy of the business. And those are not separate conversations. They need to come around the table so people can say, this is what the data says, but this is the opportunity that we see. And most importantly, this is what the data is not covering, which I'd say probably takes me to one of my last large insights around it, which is that oftentimes when companies are looking at data, they look at it as a way of managing risk, reducing risk, to saying this data will tell us, are we headed in the right direction so we're not wasting money frivolously? Think about it as an ad campaign. Will this campaign or creative work better for us? But oftentimes that comes for a search for perfection, to say we need perfect data, perfect insights, understanding all of our customers. And at that point, they almost get past this point of profitable returns to saying we're studying a problem ad nauseum without necessarily knowing what's the criteria for making a decision. And so generally, when you take all these subjects together, what you find out is that even though it's a data book, it's a leadership-oriented data book. It's saying, I'm not here to teach you statistics and mathematical models. I'm teaching you how to take part in the conversation with the skills and perspective you have. And where are there guardrails that you should set up to say, maybe we shouldn't do this, or maybe we should? And what are those realistic expectations about where companies stumble along the way?
I love that you talk about the importance of leadership and context, right? So when you look at strategic leaders in organizations, they're not just influenced by data, right? Statistics. There's also very much kind of the stories that are told, qualitative arguments. Who are we? Who do we want to become? And so forth. So how do you balance these two things? So kind of, the data is always imperfect, as we both know. But how do you balance kind of the more qualitative things, including anecdotes, right? That customers tell you things directly, but that's just one data point, versus kind of, hey, this is what big data or machine learning tells me we should do.
You know what? I think you use the right term there, balance. I think a lot of companies really try to resolve that tension, not necessarily finding a balance between the quantitative and the qualitative, the art and science of data, but by saying, no, data should be all science. There should be no room for interpretation, for hard. Stories are a waste of time. We want cold, hard truths. But that ignores who we are. The fact that oftentimes when you make decisions on data, there is that subject of human bias to say, my team's going to be affected. I don't like this direction. Or customers aren't necessarily telling us everything that's going on in their decision-making process because they may not be aware of it. But smart decision makers know how to really work between the two sides, which is to say, this is what the data is telling us. I know how to use that data objectively. I know what my criteria is. I talk a lot about experimentation. I know the hypothesis we're trying to understand and validate, but I also know what the data is not saying. And I know where to take risks. And that's okay. And what I generally see is companies will be on both sides. Some will be very methodical, but they also know in times to say, these are decisions where we won't have enough data. We're going into a new area and we're going to have to take some risk. And they just keep both of those sides and both of those processes in balance.
Okay. So as you talk about the risk, right? I mean, that's very kind of strong on my mind. We're taping this the first week of November in 2022. And so, a lot of people I talk to, also advertisers, they're worried about risks, right? Macro risks about the economy that come down to their categories. So to what extent kind of, does data really help you to balance that risk and maybe argue for stuff that, that people above you just want to cut, right? As a very kind of conservative approach to risk. How, are there ways that data can really help you make the argument for, in sailing, people say, well, if everybody's cutting right, sometimes you should cut left, right? To make these kind of decisions that maybe go against the norm of your industry or what competitors do.
Well, that's, I think with a lot of decision making, it needs to come down to being still a structured process in the sense that I don't necessarily like the idea of people sitting around a big boardroom table throwing surprise numbers at one another. It's like, no, this market's going to grow at 5, but I have data here, and they slam it down almost like a court. No, my data says 10. Those discussions are never helpful. Instead, I like to go through it, and this is what I advocate for. I say, first of all, if we're really talking about data-driven decision making, let's admit what it's not. It's not data-driven selling. It's not somebody giving you a presentation with 30 slides saying, I want you to reach this conclusion, and I will just give you more and more data until you agree with me. Because it's very difficult for a decision maker to say, do I have the complete picture given the bias of the person presenting it to me? And so I go to the very simple question to say, in any decision, let's start with, well, what is the hypothesis? What are we really deciding? What are we saying will happen? Second is, what data do we have to support it already? Is it credible data? Where are we missing? What could we study more? And if we decided to study this more, this hypothesis more, this third question is, how would we study it? And then the fourth question is, what would we do differently? And now those questions seem fairly simple. Yeah, that sounds like a reasonable approach to experimentation. But the second, third, and fourth questions have a little bit of magic. On the second one, when we talk about how much data there is, most companies aren't sure what necessarily is the burden of proof for enough data. They can poke at errors and say, well, we didn't study this. But is that a reason to slow down the project? If you have 60,000 data points, do you need 60,001? Or did you spend too much time studying them? And it's to bring companies to the table to say, what do we need to make a decision as a group? And let's keep that consistent given the size of the opportunity we have. The third, how do we test it? That allows us to understand, not only understand the size of the opportunity, but how much time will it need to actually explore this further to get a better answer than what the data provides. And then the fourth one is perhaps my own favorite, which is, what are we going to do based on the possible outcomes? If we're going to start looking at data and running tests, we should have some type of path forward based on the possible outcomes. A lot of companies move back to these platitudes. Well, we'll let the data decide. but the data is never that clear. It's never that black and white. There's always that interpretive lens, that art that will come into it. And generally, I look at companies to say, not only do you need to understand the opportunity in front of you, how transformative is this question to your business, but also do you have agreement by how you can implement it? Because if you don't, I don't want you going forward. Yep. But if it's a huge opportunity, I want you to be mindful about the data that you've collected and how you can further validate it. But if it's a small opportunity, maybe I don't want to subject it to the same rigor. And so really what we're doing here is we're moving it apart from where companies can get isolated into a single decision. Should we invest in mobile video on YouTube for next year? Should we increase our marketing spend? And I want them to put it in a framework to say, let's actually walk through the decision and the components of that decision so we understand where things go wrong, as opposed to saying, let's just distill everything down to a yes or no. Are we doing this as a team? And that really just overweighs on the art portion of it, which we're trying to get away from.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, I always refer to working backwards from the decision, right? What you're ultimately going to do and kind of how much data you need. And I like the continuum approach a lot, instead of, should we do something or not, kind of to what extent and maybe how much investment. I was, for my last question, I was going to go, back to the interview for the Break the Wall book, right? So in that interview, you said a lot about leadership. So one of the quotes was, CEOs need to realize that success won't be determined by the first 1 to 5 or 10 individual process changes. Instead, you should be thinking, can you build a scalable process? Right. So that goes to the consistency kind of point that you make, I think. So from leadership, right, who is kind of above these separate decisions for which you had your previous criteria, what is really needed from CEOs? How can they ensure their efforts have a real impact? And what is really their task in this kind of data-driven company?
I could write a huge wish list. I'll give you a practical one, which is CEOs need to know that they're part of the conversation. I see too many times they defer it to a data science team. Our analysts will tell us, in which case they're outsourcing their decision-making for that choice. Now, that is fine in the sense that we know a CEO can't see every decision. But I also don't like to see them blind to the process that comes to some outcome. Well, you just tell me what goes on, because really what we're saying here is that in order for a company to become data-centric, the CEO needs to lead that initiative, needs to be involved, and needs to have some at least core understanding of the processes, the tools, and the people involved, where things can go right and where things can go wrong. And so I'm not saying they need to be an expert in statistics or running these tests, but they need to know how to guide and unlock the process. Where are their bottlenecks? Where are their challenges? And so what I'm really saying, and this is kind of the interesting argument for a lot of CEOs, is I'm saying you need to spend more time with your data scientists. You need to speak their language. You need to be able to translate the problems of the organization and to provide productive feedback about how the outputs of their work can be used and applied. Otherwise, that separation is, and this is actually one of the saddest stories I ever had, was that I spoke to a data science team one time and I said, what is your interface with the CEO? And they said, well, we have a really good process. Every week, we submit what's their equivalent. They have like a report of about 7 pages that includes all the KPIs, trends, and their findings to the CEO. Now, this is a dense report, but they're like, this is a summary of all of our work for the week so that he has all the information he needs to make a decision. This is pretty good. And so I was meeting with the CEO about a week later, and I said, let's talk about your interface with your data and analytics team. What does this look like? And he's like, well, it doesn't happen often enough. They work with other teams. And I said, well, what about the report that they send?
Never reads it.
And he's like, what report is that?
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, well, here's a copy of it. And he's flipping through. He's like, I've never seen this before. Yeah. And when we told the data and analytics team, just the look on their face, he'd be like, we've been preparing this report for over a year. And you're telling me out of 50, 60 reports, none of them have been read. None of them have influenced decisions. No, they haven't. And so really what I talk about here in leadership is to understand what is happening with the data. It's the same way that a CFO looks at how money is being passed to the organization, how it's being invested. A CEO needs to understand what's happening with their data and what those pipes look like. You don't need to control the individual investments, but you need to provide guidance in a way that only a CEO can, unlocking the challenges that data scientists have in activating and using that data. But you have to be hands-on with it. And so that's what I kind of encourages. It's just like, get your hands dirty, get involved in the process, because even if you don't have a lot to add, you will start to learn about the challenges that data scientists have. And at the end of the day, this is perhaps the most important thing. I don't encourage any company to be perfect. You're not going to have perfect data, perfect decision-making. I simply want better than what your competition's doing. All companies struggle with these same types of problems. All CEOs find themselves in that uncomfortable role of, I'm not comfortable with data. Am I going to look silly interacting with these teams? You want to engage because most companies don't. You want to improve those processes because most companies aren't. And simply by making small iterative progress, even though there's still probably plenty of work to be done, your company will be able to reap some of those benefits of being slightly more data-driven than the people you're competing with.
Yeah. But what I hear between the lines is that kind of some face-to-face contact with data scientists is a great idea, right? Whether it's in a happy hour or lunch, instead of only kind of communicating through these
Anything is
yeah.
better than the status quo right now
Yeah.
across most industries. Instead of just paying homage and saying we have a great data science team,
Yeah.
spending time with them and trying to understand the practical realities of their work and the gaps that exist between connecting their work to actionable outcomes.
Okay. I think this is a wonderful kind of ending point. Thanks for spending time with us, Neil. And thank you so much for your sharing and your support for data-driven decision makings in companies.
Anytime. It's my pleasure.